I'm Tom Beal. I title this Making a Difference. In one of the many motion pictures based on the Star Trek television series, Captain James Kirk, the hero of the original TV series, and my personal hero since I was about 6 years old, is killed while saving the galaxy one more time. As he is dying, Kirk asks his successor in command of the Starship Enterprise, Captain Picard, alongside whom he has been fighting, were we successful? Did we make a difference? Like many teenage boys, I joined the Navy to prove something. In my case, I wanted to prove to myself and my family that I could do something no one else in my family had done. Eventually, my service became about proving to myself that I could meet whatever challenge was presented to me. This was more difficult for me than it might seem. I am not well suited for military service, not well suited to living and working in a dangerous environment, and not well suited to leading and being responsible for the lives of men and women under my command. I hate personal conflict, and I mistrust my ability to make good decisions. Truthfully, those shortcomings made me a bad choice to command in the Navy, not to mention most other leadership roles I have taken on, including president of this church. Because I felt deep down that I was a bad choice for these roles, I was scared much of the time. And I'm not talking about that figuratively. I'm talking about losing sleep scared, needing to take medication scared, making my wife's life miserable scared. I was scared of failing, of letting people down, and of getting them injured or killed. You have no doubt read about the attack on USS Cole in Yemen 19 years ago, and the terrible collisions at sea that have occurred in the last few years, all of which have resulted in the loss of sailors' lives. As is traditional in the Navy, the captains of those ships were held accountable because a captain is always responsible for the lives of his crew and for their deaths. These officers, much more accomplished than I was, were relieved of command in disgrace. I think I could have lived with that kind of disgrace. I doubt I could have lived with myself having killed my men because I couldn't measure up to command. Throughout my naval career, my life, really, it was only through force of will that I faced up to whatever challenge confronted me, overcome my fears, and found a way to get things done while usually maintaining a facade of self-confidence. I knew the self-confidence was only a pretense. I lived in fear that the pretense would fall away and I would be exposed as one who was just plain scared. So at the end of this grim life story, why did I stay in the Navy as well as do other challenging things such as lead this congregation and be a public high school teacher? Ultimately, I go back to what Captain Kirk considered important, to make a difference. When I was captain of USS Rents, I was not popular because, in part, I was very demanding. One of the younger sailors, however, wrote me a letter one day in which he said, "Before, Rents was just a cool command to be at. Since you've taken command, I've actually learned what it means to be a sailor, a petty officer, and a shipmate." Likewise, one of my high school students wrote to me once, "During my 4 years of high school, you've been an important factor. Being able to have conversations of school, politics, or just personal funny thoughts, every conversation we've had will stick with me forever because they're wise and important topics to be discussed." Words like this have always surprised me, but even someone as dense as I can't help but realize that I have made a difference in these two lives and possibly others. As many of you know, one of my last duties in the Navy was to command American sailors at Guantanamo. I've always looked upon this assignment as the culmination of my naval career, the assignment that all of my previous experience prepared me for. I served with nearly 1,000 sailors who had no stake in the politics of the place. Like Captain Kirk, they simply wanted to make a difference and needed guidance on how to do it. It was my job to provide that guidance, and I was blessed to be allowed to do it. In the end, they made a positive difference, and I told them so. When it was time for me to leave, the commanding general told my sailors of me, quote, "No one cares more about you than this man does," end quote. Our command chaplain told me, "You set the tone." I had made a difference, which is what I had set out to do, and what made my service worthwhile, despite all of my lifelong fears. When Russ, Jim, Chris Yolanis, and I used to do a Memorial Day service, some people were offended, believing it was militaristic and therefore not a reflection of our values. But most of us who serve or have served do not reflect the foolish politicians who have led and may be leading us again into a misguided war. Like I was, they are young people who simply want to make a difference. And today, we remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice in order to do so.
I didn't join the Navy out of a surge of patriotism or love of country, although I certainly did love my country. I joined the Navy, like a great many others, because I needed a job, and the Navy made me an intriguing offer. The year was 1977, the economy was lousy, and good jobs in psychology were few. It was September, and I was just finishing up my doctoral dissertation, while casting around for job opportunities and trying to decide what exactly I wanted to do when I grew up. About the same time, I learned that the U.S. Navy was expanding its use of psychologists in its hospitals and research facilities and was recruiting applicants. Almost on a lark, I decided to apply and see what the response might be. What have I got to lose, I thought. To my surprise, I started getting phone calls from Washington, D.C., and manila envelopes full of information in the mail. The more I learned about the opportunities available, the better and better this sounded. Keep in mind now that at the time I was in graduate school, I had a beard, hair down to my shoulders, and no prior experience with the military other than a freshman year in ROTC. To make a long story short, the Navy promised me a position in Newport, and I agreed to stay at least 3 years. And I could keep my beard. As an aside, the Navy had a 200-year tradition of being the only military service that allowed beards. Unfortunately, that's no longer true. So what the heck, I thought, let's do this. My then fiancée, Sandra, agreed. We traveled to Newport, fell in love with it, and in December, I went back to Miami to take the oath and was commissioned a lieutenant junior grade in the U.S. Navy. And now, here I am, 42 years later, an old, retired Navy captain. That decision back then was one of those forks in the road of life, which you don't realize at the time, but which sets your life on a particular path that changes everything in your life from then on. And as far as forks in the road go, this was a big one. Joining the Navy was very much a leap of faith for me. But pretty much by dumb luck or divine intervention, I found myself just where I think I was meant to be. What I found out fairly quickly was that the Navy was not so much an occupation as a vocation. I quickly learned, because I was frequently told by senior officers, that I was a naval officer first and a psychologist second. Much of my 22 years in the Naval Reserve were actually spent doing things that had very little to do with psychology and a lot to do with being a leader and manager. What I found in the active Navy and in the Reserve Force were some of the most impressive people I've ever met. People who were smart, dedicated, unselfish, people who were committed to doing their best, people who were willing to make huge sacrifices to do whatever duty called on them to do. People you couldn't help but admire and value. Was everybody I met like this? Of course not. The Navy has its turkeys, its deadwood, its injustices. Like any large institution or community, there were a few weak links and a few bad apples. But these were always the exception, never the rule. The vast majority of people I served with were thoughtful, hardworking, kind, respectful, and highly dedicated. What continually impressed me the most, however, was the quiet courage that military members and their families always displayed so often and so routinely that it seemed less like courage and more like just doing what had to be done. But it was courage nonetheless. The courage of a Navy medic who was willing to risk his or her life to help a wounded sailor or Marine. The courage of a fighter pilot who takes off from the pitching deck of a carrier, knowing that there is a small but real chance that he or she might not return. And when he or she does return, they face landing on the deck of a carrier that looks to them to be the size of a postage stamp, maybe at night, in pitch darkness, running low on fuel, and hundreds of miles at sea. And tomorrow or the next day, they will wake up and do it all over again. Then there's the third-class petty officer who risks promotion and even her career by blowing the whistle on a senior officer engaged in improper activity because, quote, it's the right thing to do, end quote. Or the quiet courage of the 21-year-old submariner, a nuclear power technician who knows that people's lives aboard the submarine depend on his doing his job exactly right. So every day, he does his job exactly right. Then there's the courage of a Navy nurse who leaves her or his home and family for who knows where or how long when orders to deploy are received. If you ask any of these folks if they are courageous, they would likely say, no, just doing my job. For me to be on the same team as these people was truly an honor. I read a statistic that only 2% of the U.S. population ever serves in the military. That strikes me as a shame, because the opportunity to serve your country affords benefits that few other occupations offer. For me, caring for service members who had mental health problems, as well as providing training to prevent such problems, was deeply satisfying and rewarding, albeit sometimes frustrating. In addition to being part of several medical units, including the Marines, and eventually becoming the officer in charge of 3 fleet hospital units, was deeply gratifying. My service was, I believe, beneficial to a great many service members and also to the larger Navy itself. While I was never required to put my life on the line as a naval officer, thank my stars, I did have the opportunity to work with and treat many men and women who did just that. I consider knowing them an honor. And by providing a vital and essential service to the Navy, and by extension to my country, I feel like I did my duty as best I could. If I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't hesitate for a minute. In closing, let me read a quote from John F. Kennedy, himself a decorated naval officer, from August 1963, 3 months before his death. And I would add that when he refers to man nowadays, it would be men and women. Quote, "I can imagine no more rewarding career, and any man who may be asked in this century what he did to make his life worthwhile, I think can respond with a good deal of pride and satisfaction. I served in the United States Navy." That's certainly true for me. Thank you for listening and for your support of our men and women in uniform.
That's what I got. That's probably about 15 minutes. Good morning, everybody. I've thought about this off and on for the last few weeks. Actually read Reverend Bill's little note. I had to ask him for it a second time because my computer decided to burp, and read through what that said. Why I ended up in the Navy is an interesting question. In 1958, I knew exactly what I was going to do for the rest of my life. It didn't happen. In 1958, I left high school, went to Boston University, got involved with the Student Christian Association there, which is a conglomerate of all of the Protestant type, whatever they are, groups. And of course, then there's Newman, it's the Catholic side, and Hillel, which is the Jewish side. I was active. I have the distinction of putting together the first ecumenical services that were ever run at Boston University. I was on my way to be a minister. I knew that. I knew that prior to 1958. And then I started running into the walls. Those walls are the bureaucracy of every single religious group that I can think of. They got rules and regulations and everything else that goes along with that, including the UUs. Of course, those are individual ones that you have to run through too. They're not a set over here someplace. And I decided this was wrong, and I joined the Navy. I had a friend, a Boy Scout leader, who was a Navy bosun mate, and he set a good example for me when I was a Boy Scout, and thought, I don't fly very well, I can swim okay, I don't like rolling around in the mud and sleeping in it. So that left the Navy. I joined the Navy in 1963. People said, how can you do that? They got all these other, this is this and this is this. And I said, yep. And they got a whole bunch of regulations too, and you got to follow them because they say this is the way we're going to do it. And it's down there in black and white, sort of. Anyway, I joined. I enlisted, actually went to boot camp. Had a Master Chief tell me, which I thought saying Master Chief was a respectful thing to do, and he informed me I was to address him as sir. I decided I did not want to go to the back of the barracks and say the Lord's Prayer every night. And the poor kid that was charged with telling me, I said, why? So I went and asked the chaplain, and the chaplain said, tell him the lieutenant said you had to do that. Well, I learned very quickly, lieutenants, chaplain corps, the rank means nothing. An ensign has more power over a lieutenant on a boat than, and I mean a boat, not a ship, on anything, than that officer. Got to OCS the next year and volunteered to be the person to deal with the religious side of being in the Navy, which was interesting back then. That's 64. And I talked to the chaplain, and he said, I agree with you, but the rule is you got to go to church for the first 6 weeks you're here. I said, okay, I can handle that. And moved on. I had a number of commands. I went from Newport to Portsmouth. Naive me, I thought I was going to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and I would be able to actually see that young lady down there that I married on the day next day after I graduated from OCS. Nah, they meant Portsmouth, Virginia. So she was in the Boston area at Harvard, and I was in Virginia. Interesting. but we got to see each other periodically. I went from there to a ship out of Newport, had a good time on that ship, had a nutty commanding officer who was a mass maritime person, so we did merchant things and played games, and I like playing games. I learned how to fly a Dash, which is a little drone helicopter, and we got told we were going to make attacks on other ships. I thought that would be fun. We ought to be able to prove that we hit them. So I would attach flour to the release thing and drop it on their deck so they couldn't say we didn't get them. Went from there to a school, went from there to another ship, and November 17th, I think it was, at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon in 1970, I got a call from Washington saying, you need to transfer off of your ship and you're going to Vietnam. The sailors that were in that room where I got the phone call stepped out of the room and closed the door. I was not at all polite to this gentleman that was calling me. I did call him back and apologize the next day because he was doing his job. And off I went, the first of the year. Vietnam was an interesting experience, and I say that really. I got there, I was in charge of a unit. My one instruction to the individuals was, you keep yourself safe, and I do not want to have the obligation of writing a letter to your families. I did not ever have to do that. I watched out for them, and thankfully they watched out for me, because I was nutty enough. I would walk around downtown Boston myself. And Vietnam wasn't any worse than certain areas of downtown Boston. So think about it. I got invited to homes of families in Vietnam. I got invited to be one of the guests at the High Holy Day of the Buddhist group in the town. As most of you know, I'm pretty much of a nut anyway. We had a problem with a dog that we had, and I said, take him on the plane. They said, they're not going to let him. I said, yeah, I'll cut him a set of orders. Well, I'll be a little vulgar, but the dog's name was Shitter, and I put those on the orders. And they laughed and let the dog on the plane. Hey, what can you do? Wasn't a pleasant place. I will grant you that. There are pieces that I can go back and look at and say, it was okay. I learned an awful lot. I laughed when I shouldn't have when my senior petty officer made some derogatory comment about an admiral that was walking alongside of me. And the next thing I knew, I was being sent home. And before I left, the last thing that I did was go into the personnel office and advance him to chief, which I could do with that power that I had as his commanding officer. So, as far as I know, he made chief petty officer for his inappropriate remark. Had I known it was that easy, I probably would have had it done earlier. Had a discussion with my detailer about where to go. It was in the period of 71, and I was offered the XO of the Constitution, and I turned it down. Was probably one of the best choices that I made. I went to OCS again on the staff. I was the senior lieutenant on the base at the time, which gave me unbelievable power, folks. I could say things and people would do it. But I had a lot of experiences, and I learned race relations was coming up, and myself and the Master Chief for the command were a team, and we were both facilitators, and we did what were called upward seminars or race relations seminars. And it was not specific black-white issue, it was trying to identify inside yourself. I ran 2 programs that had to do with foreign officers coming in. Got a certificate from one of the ambassadors down at the UN when I brought a group of her students down there to visit. I learned an awful lot from that time. I knew I was not going to make lieutenant commander, so I wouldn't be able to stay in. I opted to go out and go into the reserve, made it into the reserves. And within a year, I was lieutenant commander. And I dropped back into the place where I was transferred off of active duty into the reserves, and all of the enlisted people in that building came out and were clapping their hands, and I looked at them and I said, "You knew this was going to happen, didn't you?" And they said, "Yes, sir." So it was a refreshing experience. I went on, made commander. I know the difference between what the rank can carry. I know how to do that. Part of me can do that, and sometimes, I don't know if anybody in here has heard me say it, but I warn people that I'm about to turn my hat around and become a commander. I loved what I did when I got out in the real world again. It was not a bad thing. I went out. Working at Bristol Community College was fantastic. Thing about it being Memorial Day, and what Memorial Day is. This morning, it clicked. This morning when I woke up, I have worked with young people who have lost their partner in the world. One was a young girl. She had dropped into my office at BCC, and for some reason I knew I had to talk to her even though I should be someplace else, and I did. She had lost her husband in the Persian Gulf, and I didn't understand at that point how bad it was. He had never seen his daughter. His ship was sent without even a stop back in to go into the Persian Gulf, and he got knocked off the ship in what we would call an industrial accident. So just because it's military does not mean that they don't have industrial accidents. And his body was never recovered. I didn't understand that. Worked with her. He now has a stone at Arlington National Cemetery. And she's doing well. She finally decided she was going to get married last year. And there were reasons why she couldn't. She loses the benefits if she remarries of being a wife of a deceased person. The other was the wife with 3 kids from New Bedford, and her husband, National Guard, was killed in Afghanistan. It was wrong that they let her go back to go to school because she wasn't ready, but worked with her. So my experience in the Navy has been a very interesting very helpful, formed a real piece of my life. Understand that in the time that I was there, I was home for every single Christmas. I was home for every single wedding anniversary. I don't know how that happened, but it did. So I didn't miss those. I was home when, even though we couldn't get into the room where the birthing was happening, when my 2 sons were born. I was in the hospitals. No, I missed Ed's. They sent me home and said, he's not coming. Got home and there was a phone call, he had come. So, the world is each one of us have our stories. And last, to connect back to UU at the at one of the GAs 2 years ago, I think it was, 3 years ago now. I met a young lady who was becoming a lieutenant commander, and she is a UU minister. There is a group of them out there. Her boss is a commander, and they are people who can go on and go out and work with service people because they are willing to allow them to believe what they want to believe. I'm not sure that we all do that, but I pray that we do. And please take a moment, go online, take a look at what Memorial Day really is, and thank you very much.